So is it clear that I only speak English and French? And I will do the presentation in English. And if there are questions in German, maybe somebody can informally help me to understand the question. Is that okay like that? Okay. So, most of you know me, I think, but some of you may not know me. So, I'm Michel. I work in Switzerland.
I can't see you.
Sorry. I'm a psychologist, doctor in psychology, experimental psychology. But I've also studied body psychotherapy, beginning with biodynamic psychology or word of voice method, according to how you want to call it. And I've mostly practiced. I've done some research work in institutions, studying, for example, the facial behavior of suicidal patients interacting with a doctor, and noticing that you could predict suicidal risk by looking at the doctor only. It was enough. So there's obvious, I was able to show but we all know that there's a lot of resonance between therapists and patients. And my career as a body psychotherapist was mostly that of an individual therapist. Until, I would say, the end of the 80s, I also did quite a lot of group psychotherapy. Then I've stopped with that for various reasons. And last March, I began a job in Melbourne, the Swiss mountains that we'll tell you about today, where suddenly I had to participate in team psychotherapy. And given all that I learned already since March, I thought it could be interesting for body psychotherapy colleagues to be more informed of how they would also work in the context of team psychotherapy. We have somebody who did nearly the same conference, and much better probably, in Vienna, in a Vienna conference.
Yes.
But basically, a lot of body psychotherapists don't really know what team psychotherapy is about. And so I thought that you might be intrigued or interested of what it's about and why somebody, in a way like you, that is a body psychotherapist, could be interested by such an approach. There's even more people.
We found it.
Hi.
Sorry.
We couldn't find it first.
Well, it's nothing, I'm just introducing myself, so you know all that already.
Okay, I know that. That's true.
And as I'm beginning,
You all go to the back, and you have 3 chairs to put in.
Cheers.
where it's a Kandinsky image on it, which is called complex simplicity. And it exists in English, and originally, as you will see later in the conference, it was initially a French. The text has changed in every translation. Because I always, as I don't have a fixed theory, every time colleagues came to say, why didn't you say this? Why didn't you say that? So I started changing the text, trying to make it more comprehensive what my colleagues thought, even if I didn't agree. I can always say, some people say this, and I say that. That's not for me, that's not a betrayal or anything. Okay. Oh yes, just before you people arrived, we're being filmed. Is that problematic for anyone?
As long as I don't know about it, I don't care.
Okay. So it's just important that everybody knows the
English,
word.
English,
English. Entschuldigung. Okay. So I'll be presenting something called team psychotherapy. You don't usually hear that term. You hear about group psychotherapy, individual psychotherapy, but team psychotherapy is not so common, at least in places like the EADP. And my idea is to participate in the theme of this Congress, which is about psychotherapy today. We were asked if there's new ways of making diagnostics, new forms of pathologies, which Marla brilliantly described yesterday, for example. And so this is part of that project. I will start with a brief historical introduction because I can really help myself from doing some history. But I will quickly go to what I do today. So, historically speaking, I have to start with, most of you, I suppose, know who Jacques.
Does anybody have a pen? I cannot leave without a pen. I have lost the press.
A what?
Does anybody have a pen? I can use this specialist. Thank you. I've got a pen.
Okay. And I can email you the PDF if you
Right,
want.
right.
Whatever it helps anyone. It's not difficult. Just send me an email and I send you a PDF version of the PowerPoint. So, as most of you know, psychotherapy started in the Paris hospital officially, because you can always change the history if you go into different details. But officially it started with a collaboration between a man called Charcot and a man called Genet, with whom Freud initially started before he created psychoanalysis. Which was a copy of actually just a translation of Genet's method, which was called psychological analysis. But those are historical facts. And the part I wanted to tell you about Charcot is that he began a huge research on how do you differentiate epilepsy from hysteric sensory-motor automatic reactions. You know, in both those illnesses, you can have global bodily reactions that are very striking for those that see them. For example, if somebody goes in a fit in a shop, everybody's shocked. It's very dramatic. And even recently at Geneva Hospital, we had seminars because today doctors still cannot differentiate these two types of fits correctly. I think you agree with that. And we've done people have done video analysis, and some that says, oh, but maybe hysterics do this more, and epileptics do that more, but none of that works. So the fact that Charcot really tried to use all the potential he had, he was a very powerful scientist, clinical scientist, not experimental, is because it was really difficult for doctors to know, by looking at what happens, if it's epilepsy or hysteria. The main difference is that you usually don't cure from epilepsy. Maybe today, but usually in those days when you didn't. But sometimes hysterics, after 10 years in the hospital, would even become nurses in the hospital to cure the other hysterics. So somehow there's something different between the two, and Charcot wanted to know what. And he mobilized all the resources of his university department and the very big Salpêtrière hospital. And he's very interesting for us today because he was a strict scientific clinician, but he included in his research any form of healing he ever heard of that was meant to be efficient. This included work on magnetism, on hypnosis, on putting pieces of tissues or colors or any fancy thing. He says, well, try it. And then we see if it works or not. And then we try and understand why it works or not. So I think this is very important for us today, that being scientific doesn't mean excluding from a study a form of treatment. We don't have to accept the explanation of the person that does the treatment. Some healers talk of Christ, some talk of Allah, and some talks of Buddha. So their explanation somehow doesn't work, because whatever God, the same healing procedure works as well. So one thing is accepting that a form of intervention works, and another thing is not being hypnotized by theoretical debates that lead nowhere. So that was the spirit in which that research was done, and for me, the scientific committee in the ABP would have a lot to learn from such an approach.
Thank you. I'm here as a candidate.
That's good.
Yeah.
So you're
Accidental
right.
representative.
And
But we have a really diverse group, so I don't know what to say.
oh yeah, no, but I'm in no contact with the scientific committee. Actually, a long time ago, I was chairman of the scientific committee. So it is not a nasty remark. It is an ongoing debate in our association.
Okay, that sounds like a comic.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I'm glad to see that you're here and that you can think with us. And so those are the sort of sensory motor manifestations that were photographed in the 1900s we're talking about. Sometimes they went from head to feet, everything was moving, and sometimes we had foam coming out of the mouth. They were very spectacular and visible manifestation, which would suddenly pop up. And then disappear, and the person would say, hello, how are you? And usually they have a memory loss during the episode, so they don't even remember anything happened. I had patients like that. I had to tell them. They were very happy that I would tell them, oh, what happened was that this happened and that happened. And now, when he tried to find explanations, he first started with the simplest. Being a good Frenchman, he's like Descartes. You start with the simplest explanation, which is probably it's just a spinal reflex, from the spine, that has fuses blowing up for I don't know what reason. And after a while, he found that this didn't work because, for example, as I just told you, epileptic have a loss of memory. That doesn't happen in the spine, so obviously somehow the brain is involved. And then at that time, there was a lot of very brilliant neurological research in England and in the United States by people like Jackson and so on. Charcot knew them personally. And slowly it became evident that in the case of epilepsy, you had usually problems around cerebral lesion. So there was a material cerebral cause. So that lesion sometimes, as you know, gets, I'm simplifying horribly for those of you who are medical doctors, but it gets overcharged, and suddenly there's a huge discharge around that lesion that influences the spine and therefore creates all those odd movements. You just read Wikipedia and you find more intelligent explanations, but for our talk today, it's not. And then, at the same time, in his big research, members of Charcot's team were finding that, for example, hypnosis works very well. And hypnosis is not neurological. It's obviously psychological. That was the first time that an official person in the medical corpus started to say there might be psychological causes to an illness. For example, hypnosis is a psychological way of curing some, maybe not all, but some hysterical, what he called hysterical patients, be they male or female. That is how actually psychotherapy was created, because Charcot asked a young man who was working with Armand Ribot, who's the founder of French experimental psychology, and Charcot was both a medical doctor. What? Oh, I forgot to. Sorry. Oops. Sorry. And Pierre Janet was a young student in those days who wrote a brilliant book, which even if you read it today, you learn a lot, on automatic behavior, automatic changes of body and psychological state. How you can switch from sleep to hysteria to hypnosis to anger to sadness in ways you don't understand because it all happens automatically. And that remains, and that was written 10 years before Freud ever even thought about psychology. And so that young Janet had medical training, philosophical training, and he was trained in psychology by Armand Ribot, who was already working with Charcot. And so young Janet was asked to come in the team of Charcot, and he was given the mission to invent psychotherapy. When Janet called, he was the first one who used the term psychotherapy. Curing certain issues in an organism that could only be cured by psychological treatment. Hypnosis was the first one, but as you will see as we advance, very soon psychotherapy became more than just hypnosis. Okay. Now, if one looks at the general theoretical frame they were using what I call personally Lamarckian organismic psychophysiology. I think I made a mistake in my thing. I wrote psychology. I presented that in Lisbon for the first time in the Congress there. And the idea is not that the mind, in the soul image, the mind is a distinct box from the rest of the organism. And with the evolutionary theory of Lamarck, Darwin, and many others, it became obvious that there was no such box. You have somehow a certain number of routines which function very differently from each other, which connect differently with certain somatic routines, and this one will be more with muscles, this one will be more with breathing. It's a whole chaos of routines. But somehow, out of that, there emerges something which is usually called psychological. That is emotions, thoughts. As you know, thoughts can be rational, they can be a manifestation of high anxiety. There's all sorts of ways of thinking, which has all sorts of influences on our physiology. And also, our physiology has all sorts of impacts on our way of thinking. So for them, it was obvious that they should continue the classical treatments where a hysterical patient would see a somatic doctor, a neurologist, physiotherapist, who would loosen the muscles and open up the breathing. There was showers and baths so that you could have a better sensation of where the body begins, where the body stops, and what else did I put? And of course, like in all illnesses, doctors always take a very detailed history of their patients. I mean, even for just somatic people. What changed with hysterical patients was that they also saw psychologists. That is completely new in the history of medicine, at least in France. And that psychologist practiced psychotherapy. That means that he didn't only use hypnosis, but his main aim was to strengthen the mind, increase the patient's awareness of emotional, relational, and body dynamics. The rationale for them is that they were working with people who had severe traumatic forms of dissociation. When you dissociate, it means, for example, you usually dissociate from one state to another. Like when you're hypnotized, you have memories that come, the person wakes you up, those memories are gone. I'll detail that model in a bit, in a while. But the idea is that people who dissociate a lot have such a weak conscious mode of functioning that there's no problem to dissociate completely. Some people, like borderlines, they can be angry 1 minute with you, and then they're all kind and sexy, and they even forgot they ever were angry. And it's sometimes hard to believe when you're in front of a borderline and you say, but you were so angry 10 minutes ago with me. How come you're so nice suddenly? And he says, why are you so aggressive with me? You know? So dissociation is a form of consciousness where you don't remember what consciousness you had before. We're not quite in the same scheme, if you notice, as Freud's unconscious. Because what was conscious 1 minute becomes unconscious the other minute, which is why Genet used the word subconscious. Because it's not something that can never be conscious. It's something that can only be conscious in a given state, psychological state. And so because of that, strengthening the mind, well, Gustav yesterday talked of ego strengthening, but that was, as you know, Freud's theory in the 1920s. We're now nearly 50 years later. But finally, the aim is the same, to have a better containment, a better awareness of what's happening in our organism from one moment to another. So that is the first form of psychotherapy I wanted to remind you of. And the important point of body psychotherapy is to remind you that in those days, the body was eminently there. The physical body, the physiological body, emotions, dissociation is a cognitive problem. When you pass from one state to another, you have different memories. It was a form of psychotherapy which included every level of the human being. But it could never be practiced by a single practitioner. You needed experts in physiotherapy, experts in hypnosis. Maybe the guy who does the history of the patient is not the same one that does the hypnosis. And they would talk together and share the information. So that's what I call team psychotherapy. So nobody can, Freud tried to do that alone when he arrived in Vienna afterwards, and it just didn't work. He gradually had to simplify the modes of intervention until the patient, as you know, couldn't move even anymore. And he would just speak, and he did very interesting work. I mean, I'm not attacking Freud, by the way. It's just that doing such an immense, encompassing approach of a patient could not be done by an individual therapist in the practice, at least in those days. Maybe some of you can today, but that's an open discussion. So there, I'm going to read you a quote from Gustav Warlock. We're going to make that very brief. There's a big historical shock you will see. But I won't go into details. I'm just mentioning that it existed. Warlock's way of saying that is, it is one of the curiosities of modern psychodynamic psychology that the pioneering work of Genet, who predated Freud's fundamentals of psychoanalysis, was almost completely forgotten or ignored during the 20th century. And psychoanalysis became the absolute dominating force in the field of depth psychological therapy, at least out of the last decades of the century. It wasn't quite as bad as that, but nearly. The psychoanalysts were very aggressive, and Freud was very explicit about destroying enemies, trying to take the power in all the hospitals, in all the towns. And I remember when I was a young student, I was working with a very famous psychologist called Piaget, but you had psychoanalysts around, no, but Piaget doesn't even talk of the real unconscious, as if Freud's unconscious was the only possible real unconscious. I remember Paul Boyson telling me, Michael, you're not talking of the real unconscious, because he had a psychoanalytical fad in background in those days. So they were just imposing a sort of model of psychology and of the organism with which you could not negotiate it. If you were not using Freud's unconscious model, you were just stupid. There was no scientific discussion. And Piaget tried to do psychoanalysis what's the name already? The Jung's ex-girlfriend.
Yeah,
Sabina Spielrein. She tried to psychoanalyze him, but she stopped after 6 months because all of he was a friend of Janet. Janet was one of his admired personalities, and he kept railing against Freud and the stupidities of psychoanalysis from the point of view of psychology. So she just stopped doing the psychoanalysis. They never could go into his emotions. But that was the historical context that until the 1970s, you sometimes said, oh, but I'm a Jungian, but you already. And of course, some of us would say, oh, but I'm a Reichian. That was even worse. I was forbidden to be a Reichian in the university when I did my PhD thesis. I did it on posture, but I was told you can only do that if you never talk of Reich because you're too biased. So the omnipresent, quasi-mafia-like power of psychoanalysis, it was incredible. In 1913, Janet wrote a whole book where he compared the Freudians to Christian Scientist sects. Literally, he wrote a whole book on that. And it was a conference he did in front of Jones in London. There was Jung in the room, there was Jones in the room, and he had no problem saying that you could exclude Jung like that. Because he was very accurate, because he invented psychological analysis. And psychological analysis was an attempt to combine all the forms of research on intimate life. There was no specific school, no special credo. And suddenly that Freud guy, so Janet was very angry, steals his word, psychoanalysis. If you translate psychological analysis in German, it becomes quickly psychoanalysis. Steals his word, and then imposes opinions, and kicks people who disagree out. Adler, Jung, and so on. And so there was great anger in those discussions, which for a while ended with the defeat of Janet as a psychotherapist. Janet was at the Collège de France. He was a highly respected scientific. He did scientific studies on the relation between cognition and sensory motor reactions. So there's no way there was nobody. Reich wasn't the first one to introduce the body in psychology.
I think it's a great with somebody, nobody, everybody.
Exactly.
Body.
So this changed in the 60s when, I've got something here I should show. Oops. Sorry. It changed for two reasons after 68. One, there's a very famous book by Ellenberger on the history of the unconscious, which clearly showed that the unconscious was explicitly and very well used by Janet long before Freud. And so Janet's name began to be used from then onwards to eliminate the power games of the psychoanalysts. Basically, that was the main target. The first reason why people made Janet come back into the discussion in the literature. We have to stop this guy saying he knows everything. It's like in body psychotherapy, we have to stop that image of Reich that knows everything. We are colleagues, we're all inventing everything all the time. That was Janet's spirit and Ellenberger's spirit. And then there was also a clinical reason why Janet became popular again. There's a famous couple, you probably know their name, Van der Kolk and Van der Hart, in 1989, started saying, if you want to work on coma, you have to go back to team psychotherapy and use the dissociation theory of Janet and the notion of psychological states of Janet. And you find a very good summary of that in a very easy book. I love the book. It's very easy to read. Van der Kolk's recent The Body Keeps the Score, where he again takes the hypothesis that psychological dynamics creates something like a lesion in the brain that can then activate a whole neurological circuit going down the spine into electricity. In the same way, he uses the reverse model where physiological events or movements can spread up through the spine to the brain and influence how we think and how we feel and experience reality. So right now, and that, as you know, was used a lot for American soldiers in Vietnam, and then it's still being used a lot with American soldiers who were in Muslim countries recently. So it has become, in a way, the talk of trauma therapy. If I listen to the presentations in the EEP today, I hear much more about trauma therapy than about psychoanalysis. So there's been a real in-depth change around the renewal genus theory in the thoughts. Of course, there's other. Gen is not the only factor. There's, as you know, systemic psychotherapy that appeared. There's cognitive and behavioral therapy that appeared. There's humanistic psychology that appeared. There's, Gestalt. I mean, now the diversity is there. We can start discussing and arguing in a more healthy atmosphere. So that's the historical part with which I wanted to introduce the institution where I work today, doing team psychotherapy. Then I would situate that in that, I would say, discussion. As a present formulation, there are many others around the world, but I'll just talk about the one I know. And so this clinic where I work since the beginning of March is in this beautiful landscape, high up on one of those hills. A bit like the magic mountain of Thomas Mann. And I can walk out of my office at 5 in the evening and walk 2 hours on the mountain until I reach my home. It's very agreeable just from that point.
That's a good supervision from the nature.
And so that's the clinic. It's called Le Noirmont. Le Noirmont is a small town in the Swiss Jura. And it has one of the best-known Swiss restaurants in the village, so it's a highly reputable village. And as you see, it's a clinic where physiotherapy, gymnastics, massage, and things like that are used, as well as psychiatry, psychotherapy, and I'll talk about all that. So, I don't know if you can read or not, but here you have a bit the structure of the departments. I put it in German. So you have the beginning was a cardiovascular place for rehabilitation. Somebody had a stroke, couldn't walk anymore, couldn't speak anymore, went under emotional shock. They could be brought into the clinic. It's reimbursed, so poor people could do it too. And there, very near, there's one of the best, there's the best, I think, gymnastics schools of Switzerland. And so you had gymnastic people who would, remake the muscles work and redo the breathing work and organize walks. Or if it's winter, you could ski, walking ski, how do you call that? Walking ski. Yeah. And then gradually you had physiotherapists coming in, and they would look at details to repair the body of the patient. And gradually, that was the beginning of the clinic. And then you have orthopedics. You see what orthopedics is? We have lots of people who had car accidents and have very painful backs, which have been operated. How do they survive that? And so again, doing yoga, doing relaxation, doing gymnastics, looking also at how they're eating, because weight is a problem for a spine and so on. So the clinic then is sort of extended. And as you notice, for body psychotherapy, something is missing in that picture. As you've got the physical body, you've got the somatic body, but there's nothing about emotions for the moment. And that's when my boss, more than 10 years ago, created psychosomatische rehabilitation, psychosomatic rehabilitation. so that people who are in deep psychosomatic distress can come in the clinic. And so there he developed, of course, a psychiatric side which has no problem of using modern medications. There's no conflict between body work and medication in that department. Doesn't mean you have to agree, we're just saying how it happens. There's psychotherapy, and as I told you, there's a lot of yoga, tai chi, Buddhist walking, pleine conscience, how do you say that in English? Mindfulness and things like that. And that's the psychosomatic department I'm in. And next to that, there's also a certain number of services. So physiotherapy I mentioned. There's also good work on diabetology, because sometimes we have diabetic patients. The other day we had one, she didn't know she was diabetic, and suddenly we found it lucky for her. And there's occupational therapy. There's also dietetic, discussing with people how they eat. And maybe, like some depressed people, they're not hungry anymore, especially when they're alone. How do you work that with them and so on. But always with that spirit that it's the team that coordinates all of this type of data. You don't have a patient that goes to this person and that person as you have in normal treatments. It's if this person has that problem and that problem and that problem, we could maybe propose some, like we simplify the medication, because people go to X and, I don't know how many doctors for this and that, and then they have a list like this of medication, where the secondary effects are, of course, piling up. So there's also a need to clean up the medication aspect. Tell me if I'm going too quickly. And that's the guy who did this, and he's interesting for the EABP, I'll tell you why. His father was a Vietnamese ambassador in Europe.
A
Vietnamese ambassador who had some money. And he came to Switzerland, and then he went to Belgium. And his son, whom you see there, who's my boss, studied medicine in Belgium and then psychiatry in Switzerland. He got a training in Jungian psychotherapy. He does a lot of hypnosis. But he also does Buddhist meditation, Buddhist walking. He loves Taoism. And what's interesting was that his father created a foundation to build a bridge between Chinese and European ways of thinking. Now, the interesting take in that, which we could put into the EABP, is that he starts from the point of view that Chinese people and European people don't think the same way. They don't use the same psychological tools. And that it would be stupid to try and sort of make a gemisch salad of those two ways of thinking. He tells us, I'm Chinese, I don't view things with concepts and categories like you. I have a completely different way of seeing how the department should work. At the same time, says you're Europeans, you have those nice categories and things like that which are really useful. And you can use them and help me with my Chinese way to make the whole department work. And when he started doing his psychosomatic department with all those disciplines, he applied the same way of thinking. Two different techniques have two different ways of thinking. They have two different ways of interacting with patients. They don't select the same items when they look at the patient. They don't react in the same way. And that if you want a good EABP, because in the think tank, as you know, I'm part of the think tank, we're trying to agree on what the word body means, for example, and none of us agree. So we notice that all the schools in the EABP think completely differently. So or we try and make an umbrella theory where you say, if you think this way, you're a body psychotherapist, and if you think that way, you're a not a body psychotherapist. You're completely out of the logic of why I find his logic very interesting, which is accepting all the different ways of thinking, of perceiving, of treating information as being original, creative, respectable ways of working. And then seeing how we can talk with each other and maybe even unite our strengths instead of weakening it. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to present to you Duke Lepoint's foundation, is because he made for me very explicit something I've always been saying somehow. And I think a lot of you have been saying the same thing somehow. But for me, it's the first time I can say it in a way where I think I'm clear. Yeah, you want to ask that?
Yeah. He's Vietnamese, and the Vietnamese have the same medical belief than the Chinese.
Well, his father was very Chinese. You have several Vietnamese people, you know.
Okay, yeah.
It's
I just wanted to know
Indochina.
if
So,
it's
yeah.
general.
But his father also learned Sanskrit. He was very intellectual.
Okay, so.
And so he became a psychiatrist, and he created, there you have his label on our website. So he's chef arts psychomotrice chez psychiatrie psychothérapie at Le Noir Clinic. But that's the spirit to which I was happy to participate. This is our team. So there's psychiatrists, there's somatic doctor, there's psychologists, there's secretaries, there's nurses, there's gym teachers, there's Nathalie is doing Qigong, Laurence is doing yoga, Barat is doing pleine conscience,
Mindfulness.
and so on. So there, and here you have the physiotherapist also does yoga. So she does yoga in a more physiotherapeutic way maybe than, for example, some of you would like a more spiritual way, and so on. And then so the patients try out all those methods. There's many others, but I won't give you the whole list. I added up the jellyfish number of those methods. And then they're told where they can go on after their stay in the clinic to continue doing those things if they have discovered that it was good for them. And the psychiatrists are, one is Jungian, the other one is systemician, the other one is CBT. The psychologist is about the same diversity except as me, who's a body psychotherapist on top. That's what I call team psychotherapy, is a collaboration by this sort of diversity. Plus, we are also working with a physiotherapist and so on. And every Thursday we have a meeting with absolutely everybody that has a patient in the department at that moment to see what we can coordinate.
Michel,
Yeah?
when you talk about this, it's like a really joy in me, because 1973, Jay Staffel and I came to Amsterdam, to Utrecht. We brought body psychotherapy to the Netherlands. That was in the history. And I asked Jay, what do you want? What shall we call our institute? For me, it was biodynamic psychology, but I was with Jay. So I said, what do you want? Because he called it unity methods. What do you want? We want to unify all methods. So that was the core of unity psychology.
And that's why he fought for at Davos. That's what he fought for the creation of the ABP, was so that we stop being schools that shout at each other, and we start being together at the same conferences, eating together, dancing together, sometimes loving together. And a dialogue, it becomes a field, not just people who glare at each other. And Jay is the one that began the whole project, as far as I remember.
He didn't want to call his method for psychology, because his students wanted it when they got the diploma, that it was unity psychology. Jay Staffel said to me, Mona, he said, okay, that we take this name for my work. I said, that's fine, I have biodynamic psychology, was very happy about
And it
that.
was in the air, because David, with biosynthesis, was also publishing in his journal nearly everyone. And if you remember, at Esselen, we also had yoga, bodywork, Gindler, Reich, Gestalt, Alan Watts doing meditation, Ravi Shankar making music. But it was in the spirit, and so I'm happy to have a job where we're still in that spirit.
Yeah, I must add also, they would tell us the journal of bioenergetic and bioenergy, journal of bioenergy. That is what it was called in 1970s, end of the 60s, and that included all body psychotherapy, all therapies and all. Then, after many years, he came the Journal of Biosynthesis. So his own name. His speed was over for all, but there was a change.
So, but his newspaper was Energy and Character.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. And the character, but then it became the
Journal of
journal.
Biosynthesis.
So you got the point.
Yeah, I got the point.
Well, that was additional because we are pioneer and we know the history. So I'm very happy to see it actually happening.
So I'm showing you my office
Yes.
as it appeared this winter when I moved in. It's not yet decorated. But I just wanted to show you that they paid a lot of money for a massage table, which is very rare for psychologists,
Luxurious.
you know.
You can lift it up and down.
Yeah, you can do it. Zoom, zoom,
You're gonna
zoom, zoom,
yeah, excellent.
everything, yeah.
Because that is when you have a praxis and it's always there. But when you're moving, you have to have clapped together.
Yeah.
You know, so you have the right one in the praxis.
Exactly. Okay, now I've presented the general frame. I'd like us to go in a few precise issues of why, it's not just, it's lovely to do team psychotherapy, but what is it we do with patients that I couldn't do before and that I love doing? And there are a lot of things, I still see patients in Lausanne, there are a lot of things I can't do in the clinic. So I'm not saying one is better than the other. The thing is, for certain things, the clinic is really fascinating. And for other things, the clinic is useless. So, maybe to start with, so we're going to talk about particular ways of working with dissociation, which I think you can only do in team psychotherapy, as Van der Kolk demonstrated recently, and working with psychological muscular tensions and orthopedic issues to distinguish what is just body work, which is just psychological work, and what is what Reich called vegetative work, that is, the connections between. So to start with, to say how we met was because the French version of my book came out in 2006. And as you know, it begins with Tai Chi and yoga. It continues through philosophies, biology, urology, then psychoanalysis, Reich, Oslo, body psychotherapy in general, and ends up with nonverbal communication studies, like Daniel Stern and things like that. And so when Duc Lepointe saw the book, he says, that's just the person we need for supervision. Because basically what that book says, he's one of the rare persons that can talk with physiotherapists, the language of physiotherapists, with psychologists, the language of psychologists, and so on. So for quite a few years I was supervisor, and I mostly focused on 3 points. Is checking that all the professions involved integrate issues and behaviors displayed by patients who suffer from psychosomatic difficulties. For example, a nurse is not trained to look at a patient who starts cutting his arm. So how does we had to deal with how does the nurse react to that? Can she take it? And if she can't take it, how can we help her? Or do we need to leave those patients out of the department because the nurses can't take it? So we had discussions like that. Then the second thing is checking that the methods we use are blended in function of the needs of particular patients. You don't just say you go to yoga now and then you go to psychotherapy now and then you go to physiotherapy now, because that may be completely irrelevant for some patients. For example, people who suffer from grave orthopedics problem and can hardly move, you're not going to send them doing a walk with a sports teacher. So one thing we did in supervision is how do you blend those methods in a way that it fits that particular need for that particular patient. And we did a lot of supervision work on that. And the third important point was how do we find ways of discussing with each other with respect in an integrated way? Like, I'm sorry, but when you use that term, what do you mean? And so, or when you say you do grounding, what is grounding? And so on and so on. So that was also a very important part of that work, was that we have a sort of, not common vocabulary, because each one must be able to keep his vocabulary, that's the important part, but that we understand each other. And that we can suddenly say, oh, but you're doing just what I think my patient needs. Can you take that person for a few sessions and things like that? So that's what we mainly did during those supervision hours. And I also sent a few patients up there, and I was flabbergasted by how well they were when they came back. And I was very impressed with some of my patients with whom I had a difficult time. And they came back. So I ended up meeting, joining their team. One of the things that we're still working on, but which I sort of started, where I started opening the discussion in the supervisions already, was that quite a few patients presented profiles that were close. I haven't finished my PowerPoint, so it gets worse and worse. I didn't have time,
Okay.
so you'll have to excuse myself. No, it's just text, you know, and it's unsorted text, and I don't know in my heart. But what obviously came, we were in the psychosomatic department, so we have people with physical and psychological issues, which is exactly the definition of hysteria as it was proposed in Janet's days and in Freud's days. Today, as you know, we tend to call them conversion issues. Conversion disorders. And we had, of course, a lot of issues also because the insurance companies played an important role in all this discussion, as we have very poor people sometimes who are highly dependent on whether they will have the support of insurance or not. So sometimes insurance would say, oh, it's just psychological and hysterical, we don't give you any money, or things like that. So we really had to find ways of calibrating what is physical, what is psychological, and also introduce to insurance companies the fact that we have that vegetative connecting dimension, which you can't just banalize, because the sufferance that some of them have is so big, you can't just laugh at it. So we spent a lot of time during that. And as we advance with those problems of different psychological organizations and different forms of dissociation, we of course noticed in the supervision groups of the team what Kernberg had often described, that the conflicts in the team reflected the splitting parts of the patients. And so I also introduced Kernberg's work with projective identification.
Excuse me, could you
Yes.
repeat what Kernberg's
The
conflicts in the
Kernberg often noticed in teams, in the therapeutic teams,
Yes,
that, for example, a borderline can be very nice with some people and very nasty with some people. So you get some people in the meeting, the teamwork, who says, "Oh God, that guy! I mean, really, I can't. I mean, why do we keep him in the hospital? He's loud, you know." And the other, "But why are you so angry? He's so nice." And then suddenly you have the people in the team quarreling with each other, representing the different parts of that personality. And we didn't have that sometimes in the General Assembly. So
We have even in the ethics committee.
So that was part of the stuff we would be working and discussing. And before I go into more details, I'd like to now, I've used those terms several times, I'd like to define them now. What Janet calls a psychological state, and I call an organismic state, is a state where there is a calibration between postural, let's say I'm doing a grounding exercise. I have a certain posture, which will awaken certain physiological and vegetative phenomena, like suddenly I start vibrating after 10 minutes or something like that. And that will put me in a certain affective emotional state, nearly automatically. I'm not controlling that with my consciousness. And certain memories will come automatically, which I only have while I'm doing grounding exercises. And when I'm grounded, let's say efficiently, which is not always, I have a certain way of thinking. If suddenly I ask the person after 10 minutes of grounding to lie down, that person has changed posture. The whole physiology changes. I'm not going into details, but I'm assuming you all know that. But I'm just recalibrating this form of knowledge we have. The affective state, we have those beautiful body sensations. When it works well, we have all those twinklings and things and sensation of warmth circulating. People say, I feel whole again. And we have another set of memories that come very different from those we had during the grounding exercise. And maybe other memories also that come. So the idea is here I'm describing to you two different psychological states. Sleep and being awake is another example. And notice yet another. You can be being angry, being sad, or being sexually aroused. All those are different, distinct psychological states. And each of those states, according to Janet, I'm not saying you have to agree, just saying what the model says, in each of those states, you're in a way a different person. And then comes the issue of whether you are, how aware are you of those changes? Like when I use the jellyfish exercise, I'm working on how do you do the transitions between two states? How do you follow your states map, the geography of your states? Dissociated persons don't follow them at all. They're not even aware of them when in extreme cases. So the first thing, that's how we use the word psychological state. At least how I use it. I don't know if even in my team everybody agrees, and they don't have to. So I'm not an authority. And the other thing is, well, I think that's clear enough, is how aware are you of those passages from one state to another? I don't think I'm going to go into that now, so that I can shorten a bit my presentation. So what we do during the meetings, as I've said it already briefly, but I'll say it in more detail, is when we discuss, we make the map of the different states the person is in. And we also map the type of situations which elicit certain states. So with strongly dissociated persons, they usually are very repetitive. They can be, for example, I can have, once I have a mathematician, as I'm a psychologist, I went to university, I have a website, you can check that immediately. With me, he's very polite, he's very kind, he's very rational, and he agrees with everything, and he's very logical. And then when he goes to the dining room, he shouts at everyone, especially the servants, the persons who do the service. And when he's in front of one of those machines where you have to put your coin to get coffee, he becomes completely nervous and chaotic. I can't even know where to put the money, and why do you make me go in front of such machines and so on. And then the people in the team observe all those things. And so then we discuss, we sort of make the geography of that person. And then me, in my psychotherapeutic session, I will discuss with that person, do you realize that it was observed by our team that you passed through all those states? How aware are you of that? And that's how we go back to Jeanette's program of strengthening up consciousness, strengthening up awareness, becoming slowly capable of realizing your real states map, if you want, the federation of states you are, and things like that. And for that, for me, teamwork is unique. When I was when I had people in individual sessions, I could guess. Sometimes I could surmise. But there, in 3 days, we have the whole map anyway.
Yes.
Yeah? Yeah?
Because you see the people 24 hours.
Yeah.
More or less.
For 3 weeks or 4 weeks.
Yes. You have information that you do not get so easily.
Exactly.
Very difficult for us to get.
So it's in this sense that I find this highly useful, strategy to work with dissociation. Yeah? Oh, you want to ask a question?
Do you do setups? Like you make the person wait for an order in a restaurant?
No, we don't make any manipulation of the
Any
person.
manipulation?
No.
Oh, mean.
What?
That's mean.
Why? No, but I mean, it's a very good, I'm not, I know people who do very good work doing setups.
Yeah.
So, but we work in a way because there's all the problems when I say the people of the team discuss together and so on, you can quickly become as a patient paranoid. That can come very, and we need a lot of tact when we use such methods.
Yeah.
So we have to be very sure the person doesn't feel manipulated.
But I think if you work in a team, normally in your private practice you work with a team. You have got a secretary or a nurse or somebody. Or are you working? Do you everything alone? Are you doing everything alone? There's nobody who is on the telephone. Nobody. Oh, yeah.
Not nobody.
Yeah, you're all.
I'm on.
Yeah.
But I think.
Yeah.
Well, there are many forms of teams, of course.
Yeah.
But there I'm talking about a specific psychotherapeutic strategy. So it's not just the secretaries, or we can be several therapists in the same apartment, and sometimes we have intervision and so on. There I'm really talking of a very focused method of working.
Yes, I understand that. I wanted to point out that if you, sometimes you do not need to do a setup. I'm a medical doctor and I've got a reception. And the lady on the reception, she recognizes all these things.
Yes.
You mentioned that.
They can be very good at
And
that.
that's what you told us. It's very interesting.
Philosophically, I think when you start observing someone, you manipulate at the same time. Of course,
No need to manipulate. They come in and they have to set
an observation is set up.
Yeah, well, it's the same thing as with psychological state. As soon as somebody is in the street and set up, it's not the same person as if that person is never set up.
But if you are sensitive enough, maybe you are.
But there's someone right behind you who's rising his
Yeah, but
hand.
this is a different question. I'm not yet clear, Michael, what happens in the team if there is no unity, and what type of therapy would be better for this man? How would you solve this? Are there competitions also among
Well, for the
members?
moment, I have to say I'm impressed by how nice we are with each other. How nice we are, how comprehensive, how we listen to each other, how constructive we are with each other. But there is a hierarchy of who takes the decisions. For example, it's obvious that when there's too much argumentation, the boss may suddenly say, well, look, you're going to do it that way. I'm taking the responsibility for that.
That answers my question of the authority problem.
Well, it's always there in all teams.
But this authority derives from knowledge.
Well, this can be arguable. This is arguable. Does the boss always have the best knowledge? Anyway, he has the paychecks. So it's very delicate. I mean, in our case, we're very lucky to have a very competent boss. And I usually trust his judgment. I haven't yet seen him do something where I would really disagree. But of course, like all teams, you have some are better teams than others, because the human trust behind the construction of the team have been more or less well made.
More or less?
Well made. How careful are you to see that you only have people that can work together, and that can work with a boss is a talent you need. Yeah? Which one first? Okay, that one.
What I think, we also have these teams,
Yeah.
running their own teams and meeting together. And I think the main thing is this coherency having to offer. So, of course, you support each other and you respect each other, and in a way you are also a model for the patient, yeah? Because he has different experiences with different people and also teams, yeah? So therefore it's important to have this, it's a stupid word, but this hierarchic way in a team also, so that you support each other and then give a tight hold,
Very good.
a containment for all what's going on with the patients. Yeah, and of course, the center is the patients, and then you have all this transference stuff, also in the team, of course, but usually they should be aware of that. Yeah, and this is really interesting also to have these therapeutic teams. And about informations around, yeah, it's really good if you are in such a big institution that you have the cleaning women, yeah, or cleaning persons that enter the room. So what they give informations to you that you never thought about that. Yeah, he's such a nice guy, and then you find the bottles up there and isn't that. So,
I was working in a therapeutic foster home, and we had mainly like borderline adolescents, girls only, and we had this kind of structure, like a smooth hierarchy, and we included the cleaning woman and the cook, for example, in the team, which was very important because when they came into a crisis, the cook had a very important role because it was like taking care of them. You know, I cook what you want to eat. You know, this kind of things. We cooked together. We made you a sweet pancake or something like that, which helped them to regulate certain states they came in. And we worked in group work as
and then there is also the possibility of supervision, which I was a supervisor for that team for a long time, so supervision exists, and that's external supervision, from someone external. That's also very important.
That's very important.
Yeah?
I would like to ask, do you include, I heard that you include nutrition under physiotherapy?
No, it's physiotherapy and nutrition are two different sectors.
There you mentioned that.
Yeah.
Understood. Do you include detox first?
Detox?
Detoxing.
What detox?
Detoxing the body.
Detox.
Detoxification.
I think, well, there's detox already from alcohol and things that we have to, sometimes we ask people to stop drinking alcohol before they even enter the clinic, because we want to keep them for 3-4 weeks, we have to focus on what we have to focus on. And I don't know everything our dietitians do. I know they have a very wide variety of strategies, depending on what the person needs. And maybe they do, maybe they don't. I don't know.
To strengthen the liver,
yes.
because of the secondary effects of the medicines.
Yeah.
That's what I was curious about.
Yeah.
And do you include people who do healing?
No.
The what?
Healing.
Here.
Hands-on healing.
Hands-on.
Okay.
For the moment, we only have methods we can really defend in front of insurance companies and things like that. So we're not going into any risky directions.
Chinese medicine is, very good at this.
Well, Chinese medicine, which we do use Chinese methods, but they are relatively respectable today. In today's context, they're not at all problematic. Neither yoga. I mean, yoga is, I couldn't present my thesis in Geneva because the first chapter was, as in my book, on yoga. And my professor in social psychology says, but Michael, all the doctors will be against us if you say yoga is the most popular method for postural analysis.
When was this?
And that was in the 80s, beginning of the 80s. And luckily, I was working with a professor in Bern, who became professor in Duisburg in Germany. He told me, Michael, as long as your references are good, we're not afraid of doctors. And so finally I presented my thesis in Duisburg, and I even got a summa cum laude. So, you have those political issues in the background, of course. So that's why we have, if we want to get the support of insurance for poor people, you really need to have something that can be defended.
I come from Turkey, and the acupuncture is only allowed to be used by doctors in Turkey.
But we don't use acupuncture, we use Qigong and methods like that. Buddhist walking, meditation. But we haven't gone as far as using acupuncture, although we have nothing against it. And in our team, you know, there's an Iranian psychiatrist, there's a psychiatrist from Madagascar, the somatic doctor is also from Iran. I'm a bizarre person, nationality-wise. So, I mean, we have a very big variety of people to also include patients. Like if we have something Arabic, maybe the Iranian person will feel more competent to understand the language of the more Turkish or Arabic. I know they're very different people, I'm not mixing them up. And Iranians are also very different. But we have this sort of polyvalence. Yeah?
We have had some similar clinics too. In the 80s and 90s, they came out of a free clinic.
Yeah.
And then there was one doctor who made but there were several clinics which worked similarly with the cooks, with the cleaning stuff, even with the technicians. The whole stuff was part of the learning and teaching team, and they all gathered together once a week and exchanged between the guests, the patients, and the staff. And they tried to include nutrition as well as emotional work, spiritual work, medical work. I think the physiological work was not so much emphasized, but the rest was. Unfortunately, these sort of clinics are not any longer supported by the insurance companies because they were not oriented on gold standards and behavior therapy methods and all that stuff, and too personal and too intimate with the clients, because they made a lot of emotional work like bonding therapy and stuff like this. So it's not, for me, it's not so. I really regret that these forms of clinic work become less and less in the last years. So good for Switzerland.
Yeah. I'm wondering, do we continue the discussion or do I do my last chapter? It says you want. Okay. It's relatively short because I think you all more or less think like me, but at least in my case, I've learned a lot nevertheless by making things clearer with cases. So I can't talk of real cases because I have no permission for that. But what we have a lot is, already you said already, I'm sorry. I'm not good with filling the slides. Yeah. So I was just going to say that it's a real pleasure. One of the pleasures I have is we have a patient. And immediately the yoga teacher tells me that, the physiotherapist tells me that, and then I say, please go to this form of therapy because I'd like a feedback on what happens there. And even on bodywork, like I do massage, the physiotherapists don't do. And they do things, they can read things on ligaments and this muscle and that muscle that I couldn't do. And so you can't imagine, for me as a body psychotherapist, the pleasure I have. It's really luxury for me to have nearly immediately, it could take me 2 or 3 days, but nearly immediately I can get the sort of information I'm trying to get. And I'm going to give a few examples of the sort of information I'm trying to get. And to be then able to see the person and discuss with that person. Like, how did you perceive that muscle? How do I perceive that muscle? Oh, you see that? I didn't see that. You know, all this for me is, I've never had such luxury in terms of information work. So the sort of case I wanted to present, it's a generic case, it's not a specific one. But we have people who have had a car accident and their spine is more or less ruined. And for example, they were doing garage work and they have a certain psychological pathology and a complicated family life. Let's take that situation. So part of that is straight physiological work, you know, a broken spine, can you repair it, can you not repair it? as you know, the surgery is very often not very efficient. A spine can very quickly become too complicated for the methods we have today. And a lot of, even those that had decent surgery, come out with a lot of pain in their backs. There are also cases where you implant something, for example, in the neck, and then what was implanted starts moving again. And then the problem is, can you operate that without doing even more harm or not? So we have a lot of those very mechanical, physical issues, which can be very dramatic. Then there's a purely psychological aspect in our work. For example, a person was driving buses, and suddenly the person cannot drive buses anymore because she has diabetes. And you're not allowed to. Diabetes. If you have too much insulin, you're not entitled to drive buses and trucks and things like that. And the person, so then we have a very frequent psychological illness we have are people who are unable to accept that their life will change. It just says, I want it like before. They have no imagination, no symbolization, no possibility of optional solutions. They're just there, depressed, stuck, refusing to adapt. There's something called the adaptation syndrome, personalities. We have a lot of dependent personalities. They just want to be taken care of. And if ever you want me to take another job, please propose me one that I could take. I'm not going to look for it. And there are people who have no money. I'm not talking about people who can afford that sort of. So there we have very clear, I would say, psychiatric issues. And so in a way, a first way of approaching such patients is to have a sort of parallelistic, which is what you usually see in hospital vision, where you have the psychiatrist working on the mind and the surgeon working on the back or whatever it is. And I'm mostly working on in between the two. Because obviously if I'm depressed because my back it feels bad, I'm going to be tense. And my tensions are going to compress my spine and make the pain twice as strong. Also, typically, the pain makes me even more depressed because I can't move like before, I can't sit a long time, I can't walk a long time, there's nothing I can do like before, and I can't suicide because I have nice kids, I don't want to do that with them. And so we have a sort of vicious circle in the whole organism. And this is what a lot of the time people don't work on, is that vicious circle, which I wanted to present to you in a very simplified way today. We can talk in more details at the more vegetative level, I would say Russian level in this sense. But already there you see that the relation between your mental state and your objective physical problem is very often worsened if you have one of those vicious circles that is installed. So the issue is how to break, for example, how do you break those vicious circles? I mean, as you know, I nearly died in 2000, but then I wrote my book. So I'm not one of those patients. But some patients, if they had the illness I had in 2000, they would say, I'm dead, I'm finished, there's no hope. I can't, I've become fatter, I don't walk well, I can't do things as before. And a lot of people are completely destroyed by that. So how do you recreate, it's both psychological, that's where all the methods we use are useful. That the person learns how to feel his body sensation, feel his self-regulation system, starts developing more imagination, having visions, having images. We all do a lot of acting, most of you have imagery work also. It's not just body work, How do you realize that the problems in your childhood prevent you from perceiving this and that? For example, my mother has stayed a widow since my father died and I was 10. And then that person is now 50, divorcing, and she can't even imagine that a marriage can stop. Just to become an eternal widow. And we have all sorts of cases. I'm giving you just, a bunch of cases that show you that using both, like meditation can help a lot to help you sort of calm the engine. When some people get so, oh, but you are saying that, I'm saying that, and they get overheated all the time. How can you learn and realize that you get overheated? Or that you can't take it when your son gets overheated, or your daughter. And so those, as an individual therapist, of course I work along with that, and sometimes efficiently. But there it's so wonderful that for a few weeks the person can sort of try out, not think, analyze, but try out certain types of solution and see which are the ones where you can feel better afterwards. So now I'm finished with the discussion. But that was the last sort of small taste of the type of work we can do in that situation I wanted to present.
Very good. Well, thank you.
I don't know if there is.
Like, I must say, I have to leave now.
Okay, sure.
Okay, thank you. See you later.
Yeah? That's Milano. Milano.
Milano.
I was seeing golfing friends. Milano
I have something personal.
Yeah.
I'm Swiss, I work in Bern.
Yeah.
And I live here in Bern.
Right, yes. And what you want me to do with it?